Secretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, and Jim Warren, Chief Media Writer at the Poynter Institute for Media Studies. Today's program is on the record, but please silence your cell phones. So as you may have observed, our program season is in full swing. Despite the Cubs being in full swing, we do compete with them a little bit more than we expected to have to at this late stage of the baseball season. But I'll just mention a couple of great upcoming events. Monday, October 7th, we'll be hosting a great discussion on trade with Bill Daly and Grant Aldonas, who's from CSIS. On Thursday, the 20th, we will welcome the former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe of NATO, Sir Richard Sharif, on the threats and challenges of Russia today. And I can't recommend enough. I know it's a lot to take half a day out of your day, but we're running a symposium on populism on Monday, October 24th, and we have about 14 terrific speakers that'll be talking about the history of populism, present-day populism, and the future of populism. We have European perspectives. The head of Chatham House, Robin Niblett, will be coming with Evo. We have Latin American perspectives. We'll be talking about the Philippines. I can't recommend it enough, so block your calendar 8:30 to 1 o'clock on Monday. It'll be well worth your time. Before I welcome our introducer, just a brief disclaimer. As you know, the Council is an independent, nonpartisan organization that convenes leading global voices, engages the public, and conducts independent research to provide insights. For nearly a century, we've provided a platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement with the world. And the views of the individuals expressed on these platforms, including our website, are their own, and they do not represent the institutional positions or views of the Councils, its member, or its supporters. Now I'd like you to help me welcoming to the stage Ann Wedner, who's a member of our board, and she serves as a commissioner on the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. Thank you.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure today to welcome Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, Richard Stengel, and Chief Media Writer for the Poynter Institute for Media Studies, James Warren, to Chicago and to the Council on Global Affairs. Today, we will be discussing how the digital age is changing the way we approach the most urgent national security issues. Terror groups such as ISIL are known for their masterly use of social media tools for propaganda and recruitment. They use YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram as their mode of communication with the outside world, carefully crafting an image and public relations strategy. In short, today's battlefield has gone digital. Our speakers today will elaborate on what this means for countries and governments seeking to protect their citizens from the terrorism that has become an everyday concern for all of us. Before we begin, I would like to further introduce our speakers this morning. Prior to his service in government, Undersecretary Stengel was the managing editor of Time magazine. He served as president of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, and he taught journalism at Princeton and worked with Nelson Mandela on his autobiography. Undersecretary Stengel is also our longest serving ever, and is still, Undersecretary for Public Affairs and Public Diplomacy, which is really incredible, and he's been able to do a lot. In addition to his role at Poynter, James Warren is a contributing editor for the New York Daily News. He previously served as a managing editor of the Chicago Tribune, as a columnist for the New York Times, and as an editor for the Daily Beast. And he is a frequent contributor to the Huffington Post and the Atlantic Monthly, and regularly appears on MSNBC and Fox News. I'm so eager to hear what you have to say this morning. Please welcome Undersecretary Stengel and Mr. Warren.
You care what's that? Okay.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Chicago. The Issues, Ideas, Impact obviously refers to Bob Dylan winning the Nobel Glorious Morning.
Let's talk about that.
That it is. Yeah. Well, you're Mr. Culture, so you'll have a chance to talk about spreading the greatness of American culture, popular or not, around the world. Seriously. Just so in case anybody who pays me money isn't rankled. I'm no longer with the New York Daily News. I'm with the Poynter Institute. I'm the chief media writer. Do a newsletter that simultaneously appears each morning on Vanity Fair's website, and write politics for U.S. News and World Report. So those are the paying gigs these days. Rick, let's start this way. Tell us what the hell you do. Where are you in the org chart? And then tell us what this job of yours, which you have, I don't know whether being the longest standing guy is sort of akin to being, I don't know, coach of the Minnesota Timberwolves or something, or a Premier League coach where I think you last 18 months and then you're fired. But
It's not like Robert Byrd serving for 52 years and then.
No, not at all. Tell folks what the job is.
The job of public diplomacy is actually not an easy one to describe. Public diplomacy is the diplomacy not between governments, but between people, or between people and governments. I love the term soft power for it, that it's about America's image in the world, and in some ways, to talk about it in a commercial sense, I'm the chief marketing officer for brand USA around the world. And the job itself is actually not very old. I mean, so you can be the longest serving undersecretary at 2.5 years because the job was only created in 1999 when the US Information Agency was broken up by Jesse Helms and Joe Biden. And some of it went into the State Department, some of it became part of BBG, Broadcasting Board of Governors, which has Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, all of those Cold War brands that we still recall and are still doing a good job now.
Again, for the younger folks, what was the U.S. Information Agency?
U.S. Information Agency was an entity that was started during and after World War II during the Cold War to combat the Soviet Union's disinformation and propaganda, which sounds pretty similar today because Russia is doing similar things. And again, there was this kind of global battle of ideologies, and it was a zero-sum game. Either you accept sort of democracy and freedom, or you accept totalitarianism and autocracy. And in fact, just to go into sort of the subject of today, what we're seeing today is not this kind of ideological information war out there, but as somebody who writes about this said, it's not an information war, it's a war on information. There's this rise of disinformation and propaganda from states, and at the same time, so many of those same autocratic states are cramping down on the free flow of information at the same time. So there's a gigantic global challenge, to the truth.
Can you explain Board of Broadcast Governors and this broadcasting apparatus? I think most people don't know about. Just tell folks a little bit about, on a given day, the manifestations of their work.
So across all of those, Jim, I think
Hi there.
we need mechanical aid. Across all of those entities of international broadcasting, which is not technically part of the federal government, but has its authority from the government, I think Voice of America is in 62 different languages. Cumulatively, they reach hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. They have a very big megaphone. There are also individual channels and entities in many, many different countries around the world.
Okay, you had one of the great gigs in American media. You were the managing editor of one of the great publications. You had a lot of authority. You could decide, presumably in a given week, in a given month, how you wanted to deploy your resources, what to put on the cover, time, person of the year. Why was this job interesting? Why was this allure?
So I had the first summer when I was editor of Time, and Jim, you'll appreciate this, so that we did a cover story every week, and it was always a bit of a hair-raising act to figure out what the cover was. And one week we had an empty week during the summer, and I had been talking about, let's do a cover story on national service. And in the world that we work in, it's not as hierarchical as the State Department. So someone said, well, why don't you write it, Mr. Big Shot? And so I wrote a cover story called The Case for National Service, about how, it was quite specific about how young people between high school and college should do a year of national service, but it was a larger kind of call for volunteering and working in our national life. And so that became an annuity, a regular issue every year, and it's something I really genuinely believe in. And after a certain amount of time, when you're a superannuated editor, I thought I ought to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. And I'd had conversations with people at the White House and the State Department. And this job is one of those few jobs that, old journalists like us figure like, well, I could actually do that because it's about, marketing and communications.
When it comes to marketing communications, and before we get to sort of the sexiest topic, which is terrorism, talk about sort of the lower profile work of this job, which involves education, cultural, sports exchanges. Tell folks about that and what goes on every day.
So that's actually, for your taxpayer dollars, I think the best return are things that don't get as much attention, like educational exchanges. One of the things that people don't realize is that the Fulbright Scholarship is under the State Department. That's a State Department-sponsored scholarship. But we do all kinds of educational exchanges around the world where we bring students here, where we send American students abroad. These exchange programs are golden. If there's one called Flex, which brings young high school students from Russia and the periphery to America to spend a year staying in homes and going to high school. It's fantastic. It's transformational. And so these educational exchange programs are, in some ways, the meat and potatoes of public diplomacy, and they don't get enough attention. And frankly, we wouldn't need macro public diplomacy if we could get every young person to come here and study in America for a year. Then our job would be done.
There's one named after fabled journalist, late Edward R. Murrow, and I know at some point in recent months or earlier this year, a bunch of them were down in St. Petersburg, where the Poynter Institute is. What's
so that's the Murrow Fellowship. We bring, I don't want to get the number wrong, 100 or so young journalists from around the world, and they come to the U.S. annually. I think is it 6 weeks? And they do sort of a little bit of interning at different places. They see how newspapers and television stations work. And part of it is just this idea, and Murrow was an exemplar of it, that the free flow of information, that honest investigative reporting is the sunlight that disinfects so much that's wrong in societies and the world. And it's a chance for young journalists to see how we do it. And a lot of them come from countries where frankly, they face risks and dangers that you and I have never faced. The threat of imprisonment, torture, even death. You've seen the targeting of journalists around the world over the last decade in a way that we've never ever seen before. Journalists used to be collateral damage, to use an awful phrase, and now they're being targeted. So that's one of the terrific exchange programs that we do.
Okay, you mentioned the word terrorism. Terrorists have gone after some of these journalists. Terrorists have gone after some of our journalists. Unavoidably, this has became sort of maybe the highest profile matter that I think you've been dealing with. Explain, post-rise of ISIS, your involvement, the involvement of your operation on a daily or a weekly basis, particularly as it comes to what was a rather new effort to sort of fight social media fire with social media fire.
Right. So in 2010, was it? No, 2011, under Secretary Clinton at the State Department, a new entity was formed, which was the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. Government has terrible names for things. And that was an entity within government to fight the rise on social media of an organization called Al-Qaeda. Because what did Al-Qaeda do? They took a video of a guy on a hillside in Pakistan talking to camera for 45 minutes and then posted it on YouTube, and that seemed revolutionary. Along came ISIS, or ISIL as we call them in the government, or Daesh as we call them when we're in the Middle East. And they had a new level of sophistication in terms of the use of social media and media of all kinds. And this entity, CSCC, began to counter ISIL in the social media realm. And now that too has changed, because one of the things we realized was that, as you say, fighting social media fire with social media fire is actually a non-starter. And particularly when that fire comes from the federal government. So, a tweet from the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy to a young man in Belgium who's thinking of going to fight in Iraq and Syria is not going to dissuade him from going. In fact, what we realized in that tit for tat that we were doing is that they were using us as a recruitment tool. It was, in fact, having the exact opposite outcome that we wanted. So CSCC has become something called the Global Engagement Center, which was signed into creation by an executive order from the president about 5 months ago. And the change is that now their mission is to amplify and help credible voices, third-party voices who actually have some skin in the game and credibility, who are Muslim voices, fantastic, organizations around the world to do that, to fight ISIL on the social media grounds, rather than us doing it in our own voice.
When we spoke on this subject for a pointer piece that I did, I don't know, 4 or 5, 6, 7 months ago, you mentioned seeing with some regularity a reel, I think you referred to it as a reel, of the handiwork of ISIL, social media. What are they doing on a given day? What were the sorts of things that you were seeing? What are the sorts of things that you're seeing now, and how have they evolved, if at all?
So one of the things we're seeing right immediately is a tremendous diminishment in the amount of social media that they're doing. There was a front page, I think there's a publication you've heard of called the New York Times, had a story a couple of days ago that actually a West Point organization had seen about a 70 to even 80% decrease in the amount of social media that they're creating. And that is due, in fact, to the incredible strides that we're making on the military battlefield. ISIL controls 50% less territory in Iraq, 20% less in Syria than they did a year and a half ago. And also the pressure from the social media companies, from Twitter, from Facebook, from YouTube, who have been really, really aggressive in getting that content off. But the larger question is, what do they do? And one of the, I think we talked about this, is that I think people don't realize the kind of social media that they did. 80 to 85% of all the content they create is in Arabic. The second, anyone know the second largest language? Kathy, you're cheating. Russian. Third is English at about 7%. They're not focused on us or the American homeland, and yet they've been successful in frightening us and making us think that we're their focus. So the other kind of misnomer is that they're just doing, beheadings and graphic violence. The lion's share of their content was positive. Come to the caliphate. The caliphate it's the duty of all right-thinking Muslims to come to the caliphate. That's what the prophet bid you. You won't be a good Muslim if you don't come to the caliphate. And they had pictures of children on Ferris wheels and a cornucopia of fruit. And that was what a lot of, something like 70% of their messaging was. It's this altruistic call, which is partially why it's effective, because it appeals to people. It appeals to people who are insecure about their faith. And so that's the kind of thing that we saw that most people don't ever see.
Well, two things. First of all, when it comes to being successful at the diminishment of their output, is there any way you can deal with my 12-year-old and 7-year-old when it comes to social media? If you could, I'd appreciate it. Second,
you have to talk to Twitter and Facebook.
Oh my gosh, what are the lessons so far as your efforts in this area? How do you judge success? And if so, what's the evidence? Is it the fact that there's less of this stuff? How do you step back and say, we're doing a good job, we're doing an okay job, we're not doing such a hot job? How do you come to any conclusions?
Well, we certainly look at the decline in the amount of stuff that they're creating as a positive outcome and a success. As I was saying, it has multiple causes, and I think the role that we played had contributed to that. One part of that role is amplifying these other voices, and one of the things that we've seen since the rise of ISIL, which is not that long ago, 2 years ago, there's been a tsunami of anti-ISIL content created by people around the world, by mainstream Muslims, by imams, by clerics, by NGOs. When I first started this, I remember going to see the folks who were at Dar al-Ufta, which is the kind of think tank around the major imam in Egypt. And this fellow handed me a gigantic stack of paper. And I said, what's this? And he said, well, these are all the fatwas we issued today that are counter-ISIL. And I said, are they all on paper? And he said, yes. And I thought, can you turn them into like a half a dozen tweets? And lo and behold, we had a meeting of all of the nations and private groups that are involved in the counter-ISIL coalition just a few months ago. And there was a representative from the Grand Mufti's office, and Dar al-Ifta, and one of the things he presented to the group was a fatwa app. It was fantastic. I wanted to cry. And people have just realized that this is an existential threat to Islam, and that people who realize they need to mobilize and get the true values of Islam out to people and the repudiation of the things that ISIL have done. So there's been a large rise in messaging by real people and real groups. We've also helped create some partnerships with other governments. So we created the Sawab Center with the UAE in Abu Dhabi, which is a social media, looks like a newsroom of people doing counter-ISIL content all day long. And so there are things like that around the world. The Malaysians are doing one. So all of these things, I think, have helped on this digital battlefield. Now, if you give me 2 more seconds, the unintended consequence of this, and this is something we're seeing domestically, is there's been a migration of their content onto encrypted platforms that we don't see and that it doesn't reach a mass audience. So I don't know if people know about a platform called Telegram, for example. There's been a lot of these ISIL fanboys have left Twitter, in part because Twitter is getting rid of them too, and in part because they're targeted by our military. And they're using platforms like Telegram or WhatsApp or Signal, some of these other end-to-end encrypted platforms where they're not reaching a large audience, they're reaching individuals. That's the scary part, because it gives further rise to these lone actors phenomenon that we've seen in the domestic space, in Orlando or San Bernardino. And that is another scale problem. And it's a finer problem in the sense that it's not about mass messaging, it's about how do you deal with this from a law enforcement standpoint, even from a mental health standpoint?
And as you're mulling those questions and dealing with them, I wonder about this. Talk about any change, as a manager, changes in philosophy toward personnel recruitment. I assume for decades and decades there was a certain sort of stereotyped applicant for jobs at your level or even a little bit lower in the State Department and schools of diplomacy and foreign affairs and Georgetown and Princeton. Who are the 20-somethings that one needs now to help out? What are some of their job skills?
It's a good question, and one of the things that I've done since I've been in the job is every year, a couple of times a year, I talk to the A100 class, which is the class of about 100 or so new Foreign Service officers that are coming into the State Department. And I do think we need to be equipped for this new digital battlefield in a way that we haven't before, and the skills have to change. And I've been a big advocate, with the help of Anne and the Public Diplomacy Commission, that in a way everybody is a public diplomacy officer. You need to have those communication skills. You need to be able to translate policy into ideas and language that people can understand. And by the way, you need to be able to do that on social media and using all of those social media and technological tools that help us communicate and get into conversation with people. So I think that's a work in progress. And if there are any young people who have the technical expertise that are out there interested in joining the Foreign Service, I'd love to talk to you. I mean, I think it's important to get those skills in the arsenal of public diplomacy and in the State Department.
But do you battle or vie with the likes of, all the usual suspect digital Goliaths in hiring these people? I mean, I assume Google and whatever can pay a whole lot more money.
Not yet, we haven't, no. In fact, we've been more focused on taking people who want to come into the Foreign Service and giving them these same skills. So public affairs is also under the Undersecretary. And public affairs has come a long way. They're on now every platform under the sun. And we're developing a much broader skill set. So I think we now have over 2,000 social media handles across the State Department. Every ambassador is on Twitter and YouTube, and we're just kind of growing that as much as we can.
This is a little bit in the bureaucratic weeds, but there are some folks out there, including a good friend of mine and a predecessor of yours, Jim Glassman, who had this job near the end of George W. Bush.
Not as long as I've had it.
No. He was there like 10 minutes, and he still insists now people call him Mr. Secretary.
He had a very long
Very
confirmation
obnoxious.
process.
Yeah.
Longer than mine.
Jim makes the case, I think, for resurrecting the U.S. Information Agency. I'm not quite sure what the total rationale is, but as a way in his mind of sort of being more cohesive in messaging, essentially.
It's actually an interesting idea, and Jim and I have talked about it, and there are people sort of nibbling around the idea of this. I'm a little skeptical about it in the sense that one of the things in government, when there's something that you don't like, let's say it's ISIL messaging or counter environmental messaging, we then use the word counter. How do you counter the thing that you don't like? How do you counter ISIL messaging? And one of the things we realize is the traditional way that government counters something, which is this tit-for-tat approach, like you tweet at me, I'll tweet it back at you, is counterproductive. And that's why we changed the role of GEC to be enabling credible third-party voices that actually, resonate with people. Our content, in part, doesn't resonate with people, in part because it's government, in part because this global disinformation war, this war on information that people, young people around the world don't know the provenance of the information they have. They question, governmental sources of it. And I think they have no way of evaluating what's true and what's not true. I mean, you mentioned your kids. I mean, my kids, when they used to say, well, Dad, I read this on the internet. Well, no, you read it on the NewYorkTimes.com. Or you read it on some insane site that has no credibility, but they didn't make a distinction between the two. That's a problem. And you don't solve that problem by countering it. You have to solve it in new ways. And I'm not so sure if there were a new U.S. information agency, it would have to be some new kind of content. Because a lot of people who talk about the resurrection of it talk about it in that Cold War context, which is, if only we got the truth out to people, that would change their minds. The difference is during the Cold War, it was a different paradigm. There was a scarcity of information. We needed to broadcast beyond the Iron Curtain. Now, people in Russia can look at CNN.com in the morning. They can read the New York Times in the morning. They can go to the Pointer site in the morning. They're not doing it, and if they do it, they question the veracity of it. So that's a different kind of challenge, and it's not a challenge solved by traditional journalism, as much as we love it.
I think this is the longest conversation on public policy or anything vaguely serious has gone on in the last 6 months without mentioning Donald Trump. So let me mention him. You've done a lot of traveling. Is there any generalizations you can make about how the world that you've seen outside the U.S. has viewed the election, in particular Trump? And without, I don't want to make, straight grope to find some linkage, but has it impacted at all, your task of trying to improve our image?
So, do folks know what the Hatch Act is? The Hatch Act prevents federal employees from getting involved in federal elections. So I'm putting that up as a caveat to everything I'm about to say. But I am the chief marketing officer for the U.S. brand. What does the U.S. brand stand for? What do we talk about? What do diplomats talk about when they're talking to foreign ministers? I'll tell you what we talk about, and we talk about the things that we say we talk about. We talk about freedom of speech. We talk about freedom of religion. We talk about rule of law. We talk about due process. When you have a presidential campaign where some of the rhetoric in the campaign undermines those things and says there is a religious test for immigration or people coming into this country. I travel around the world and people ask me, well, I'm a Muslim from, Egypt. Will I be able to still come to the United States? went around the world when we talk about the importance of elections and free and fair elections, and they go, well, how's your election doing? The thing about America is we're the exception and the rule. Nobody is quite like us. On the other hand, we're the model for everybody. I had an ambassador from an African country in my office the other day who's approaching elections, and they say, we criticize you all the time, but we hold you up as a model too. And when that model begins to change or evaporate, we feel lost. And so I think there's a gigantic public diplomacy challenge to what we've seen in this election and the rhetoric in this election. And it frightens people around the world. I mean, we're a robust democracy. We've been doing it for more than 200 years. Democracy is a messy process. But to countries that prize stability over freedom, they look at our process and say, no.
It's sort of related. Recently, Pew Research surveyed a whole lot of folks in a bunch of countries, I don't know, 12 or 15, and their conclusion was that many of those that they surveyed find the U.S. Less powerful, less important than it was 10 years ago. Does that strike you as accurate?
I saw that Pew does fantastic polling, and I think there is a perception that the U.S. is sometimes less involved or even less of a hyperpower than we were before. There's been, as Fareed Zakaria, my friend and our old colleague, wrote a long time ago, a rise of the rest. I mean, there's other powers, and we see that even in the public diplomacy world. At the same time, I think the other thing that you see is that we are still the indispensable nation, that we can't solve every problem, which is what we kind of used to think, but there are some problems only we can solve. And wherever we are never replaced by a better actor. And so people depend on us still. And even the people who say, yes, there's a diminishment of US power, they want American power to intervene. And we're still seen as an honest broker. And I think one of the things we've seen with my boss, Secretary of State John Kerry, who's indefatigable in being that honest broker for people, it's something that people really value, and believe me, they will miss it if it changes.
Okay, a last question in this segment for me, and then we're going to open it up to questions from you guys. Let's finish up this part with sort of on a more personal level and contrasting your prior life with your current life.
And my future life.
Well, do you want to make any announcements?
Okay, no, I do not.
Come on. I mean, there are a few people in the State Department presumably watching this. We'll tell them not to tell anybody. How have both appealed to you? How have both perhaps not quite appealed to you? And finally, what's it like, the difference between assigning a story or even writing a great one yourself on terrorism and now being in the room trying to actually deal with it?
Well, I've absolutely loved my experience in government, and it's great to be, as someone put it, behind the flag. It's great to see that all of these values and ideas that we say we stand for, we really do stand for. It's thrilling to be in the room. Sometimes when you see the Secretary of State, saying, you folks need to release those prisoners and you need to stop harassing journalists. I mean, we really do say those things behind those closed doors. And as you and I know, who've spent so many years outside the door wondering what's going on in the room, I mean, it's wonderful to be in the room. And some part of me is always processing it with a reportorial angle. But it's so fulfilling to actually not look at it that way and actually act in the moment and talk about these things. So, so I feel, I still feel that public service is incredibly important. I mean, the framers talked about citizen politicians, citizen diplomats. It's not like people need to spend their entire career in government, but everybody has a responsibility in a democracy. And as Justice Brandeis said, the highest office in a democracy is that of citizen. And and the responsibility of a citizen is to participate. So I've found it super fulfilling, and I wish I'd gotten more done, but it's been great.
Oh, I'd be remiss in not asking, if you wear both hats simultaneously, what's been the quality of the reporting on your world, the quality of the reporting of your life inside those rooms?
It's interesting. I mean, I think, now being in government, I've ratcheted down a little bit of the percentage that I feel journalism gets about what's actually going on. I won't tell you what the percentages are. But at the same time, I think particularly with foreign policy reporting, these tend to be people who really focus on that, and they're not swayed by, Hollywood stories and campaigns. And I think it tends to be more rational and reasonable and in greater depth than you often see on domestic issues.
Great, thank you very much. Now we'll go out to the audience. Just a quick programming note is the Undersecretary's boss is coming to the Council on the 26th of October. We'll be hosting Secretary John Kerry for a big speech down at the Hilton, like the olden days at the Council. We'll have loads of rooms, so if you have any student groups or anything, please let us know.
Also, I'm just the warm-up act for that.
Yeah, so. Yes, the amuse-bouche for John Kerry. If you mentioned Fareed Zakaria, he was our opening program for this room. I'd encourage you to check out the live stream. He was fantastic and had a lot of provocative and interesting opinions. So. And you mentioned the Pew survey. The Chicago Council survey is pretty good too, we like to think. And that was up, our new one came out last week, so I'd encourage you to check that out online if you'd like. And now John de Blasio looks anxious to ask a question. There's a mic coming, John, because we're live streamed.
Right here. So first off, I clapped when you mentioned the use of third-party neutral voices, because in my experience, that's been a big gap. And I want to comment, I think it's great that you've had such a tenure and you've gone through the bumps and the ups and downs and you've figured out different ways to approach it. Two questions. We are so focused on terrorism. A grantee of the organization that I represent with the Charitable Trust is the Syria Direct. We've received grants from your organization to do work. We work as well in Ukraine on similar projects. There's a lot of money around the anti-terrorism counter-messaging, however we want to call it. There's very little in Ukraine that comes from PAPD, from aid, or even DOD. And why is that? Why are we not actively looking to counter what is clearly propaganda from the Russians? They're very good at it, and we're not really actively engaged, or at least it feels that way from the perspective of a donor in that area. Second, because I want to get two in,
okay.
That's how I cheat on these things.
Have you noticed no one ever asks one question anymore? Like
they normally do. John's being very disobedient today.
Yeah,
he knows he's breaking
Neve
the rules.
knows me well. The second is a question of the interagency approach towards counter-messaging. DOD gets way, way more money than your organization and the special organizations that you've given free rein to kind of go out and do grants. And the collaboration between their approach towards messaging and yours is perhaps not as great as it should be. They've just led another large omnibus IDIQ managed by SOCOM for all the different COCOMs. I know this is a lot of words, but it is not integrated with what you're doing to the appearance of the community that participates in the counter-messaging activities. How do you resolve to work better with the DOD, who's a much better funded organization and may not necessarily be on track with the way you're approaching this? So, two questions. Why aren't we doing more with counter-messaging in Russia? Secondly, how do we work better as a whole of government in the messaging approach we take?
I'll take the second question first and get to the Ukraine and Russia. The Global Engagement Center, which is the successor to CSCC, is run by a fellow named Michael Lumpkin. He's the new coordinator. He comes from DOD. He was the Assistant Secretary of Solik. And it is by definition, created by an executive order, an interagency group. So it has detailees from DOD, from the intelligence community, from SOCOM, and I would say by its very definition and how it's working, it is helping to unify the kind of military approach and the civilian or State Department approach. And I think we are more unified in how we do counter messaging than we've ever been during the time I've been in office. And we've worked very well with DoD on all of these things, and they do have more money than we have, and part of it is we want to hitch our wagon to their star, but part of it too is that they really understand this. I mean, and actually to use that as a segue, I mean, one of the first things that I attended was a SOCOM retreat on hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare is a term that was really created by the Russians and created during the Cold War, and DoD is very well versed in that. Shortly after I started was the illegal annexation of Crimea and the aggressive moves that Russia was making in eastern Ukraine. We stood up the Ukraine working group within the State Department to do counter messaging to the onslaught of Russian social media and disinformation and propaganda. Sun Tzu talked about information warfare 2,000 years ago, and the Russians are expert at it. So if you saw, even before the annexation of Crimea, the fact that they were on social media stoking Russian nationalism of ethnic Russians in Crimea, you saw the playbook for what they were going to do. The Russians are very, very sophisticated in this, and they're very sophisticated in cyber warfare as well. So we've actually been pretty focused on that in the State Department. We created the Ukraine working group. That has become something called the Russia Information Group that is like GEC in the sense that it's focused on that disinformation and Russian propaganda in the Russian periphery, in the Baltics, and especially in Ukraine. I fund a lot of messaging and communications organizations in Ukraine. I mean, and some of them that are well known. I mean, that they publicize it. I mean, the Ukraine Crisis Task Force, which is in Ukraine, in Kyiv. Stop Fake, which is a really interesting endeavor to actually go against this rise in disinformation. So we're very focused on that, and I'd love to spend even more money on it because it's a growing problem. And to go back to where we started, I mean, this rise of disinformation and the curtailing of the free flow of information is a gigantic challenge in the 21st century. And Russia is one of the leading practitioners in a negative way of what this kind of information battle is all about.
Thank you. Next question. Yes, Caroline Craycraft here in the front row, please. Caroline, she's coming.
You mentioned, hello, I used to be in public affairs too. You mentioned that the majority of the ISIL propaganda is in Arabic and in Russian. So how do they reach out to young women like those 4 English teenagers who were heading off to Syria? How do they reach? I doubt that they were fluent in Arabic or Russian.
So, again, the lion's share is in Arabic. More than 80%, as much as 85% is in Arabic. So it's mostly in Arabic. But one of the things that we've seen, and we touched on this earlier, is as they are losing on the military battlefield, which they are, as the caliphate will cease to exist as even a physical entity, there is this sort of digital caliphate that they're creating, and they are, as I call it, weaponizing vulnerability. They're trying to attract people who have grievances, people who have mental health issues, and that's not done with this kind of large-scale messaging that we're talking about. That's done almost in an epidemiological way, like the transference of a virus. Individual contact, repeated contact. So I don't know the background of those 4 English girls, but I would bet my bottom dollar that it's 1 or 2 people who knew them, who were recruiting them. And what we've seen in all of these cases of lone actors, it's an individual human influence rather than this misnomer that we have of they're watching watching video on YouTube, or they have a Twitter feed from ISIL's news agency. It's not that. And as we go into this more granular, finer thing, it becomes more of a law enforcement and mental health issue rather than a messaging issue.
Next question. Yeah, Walker Gunning, playing right there from Seapost.
Thank you, Secretary. Secretary Stengel, you mentioned the third-party voices kind of amplifying them. What do you find are particularly effective messages that those voices can give out to, counter ISIS propaganda?
So it's a good question. One of the ways that we got this new insight was, have I mentioned the Sawab Center? I'm not even remembering. So about a year ago, the Sawab Center, we were chatting to them, and they said, we have all of these videos of first-person testimony from ISIS defectors talking about how awful it was and how hypocritical they are and how mistreated they were. And they said, we're going to put together a defectors campaign. And one of the things we saw was, in terms of engagement, it looked like this. It went off the charts. And we realized maybe this tit-for-tat stuff is not the way to go. And maybe, like as we realized in any entity, a campaign is better. So we moved to this campaign model. But part of that campaign model is one of the things we found in almost every campaign we're involved in. It's about direct testimony from either defectors, as we call that, the defectors campaign, direct testimony from mothers who have lost their sons or daughters, very effective. Testimony from young women who have lost their husbands. I mean, so what we have found is that the thing that has great credibility and truth and resonance with people is this kind of direct testimony. And so there's a lot more of it now that's out there, and there are a lot of interesting organizations that are helping promote that, and even the social media companies are also collecting that kind of content. So one of the things that the GEC does is to help amplify those campaigns.
Next question. Yes, please, the gentleman in the back row, please.
You had relayed that citizen is the highest office. So if a citizen is the highest office, what would you describe their essential duties, and what are the virtues of the citizen as it relates to today's topic?
To this topic. That's a great question. I mean, so one of the things, and you're doing it today, is staying informed and kind of realizing how, what the reality is. But again, as an individual actor who's online and on social media, I think registering that you don't like something that promoting violent content. Everybody on every platform, you can be a flagger of content that you find offensive. All of the social media companies have their own terms of service, which are like their constitutions, where they say that here's the kind of content that we don't tolerate, here's the kind of content that needs to be reported. This kind of wisdom of crowds idea that you can help report content that you find offensive, whether it's bullying or sexism or racism or whatever. That is a role that individuals can play. How's that?
Great. I have kind of
Okay.
a follow-on question to that, as you mentioned about the citizens and in the land. Aside from the rhetoric of what's going on in the presidential election that you referenced earlier, the reality is that there is a significant group of people in America who are Islamophobic. And when November 9th happens, regardless of the outcome of the election, they'll remain that way. And I'm wondering what strategies you employ. You said you bring students back and forth, but if you're working in Abu Dhabi or Cairo and trying to make America the exceptional place that you spoke about earlier, how do you counter the reality that it's not just coming from the top, but this is a voice for Islamophobia that exists in American society?
Actually, one of the early covers that we did when I was editor of Time was a cover that the cover line was "Is America Islamophobic?" written by Bobby Ghosh, who was then our foreign editor. The reality is that people do have these ideas, and one of the things that I say to people, particularly to Muslims, I said, there are Americans who have these ideas, but they're not American ideas. And one of the things that we've seen is that people who tend to be the most Islamophobic are people who don't know a Muslim. And in fact, when people have a more diverse community where Muslims and non-Muslims are living side by side, people are less Islamophobic. So ignorance is part of the problem. And and I think just people don't realize that, the second generation Muslim immigrants to America actually start new businesses at a higher rate than long-term Americans do. They have a higher average GDP than people who have been here longer and are non-Muslim. I mean, they're one of the most successful entities within this kind of diverse patchwork quilt of America. And I think part of the problem is that people just don't know that. And I don't have a great solution to this in the sense that, of the isms of racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. I mean, they've been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and I hope all of the things that we're doing will diminish all of those things. But it is indeed a problem.
Great, thank you. Next question. You stumped everybody. That can't be possible. Okay. Oh no, John, you've already had two. Does anyone want to talk over John? Okay, if it's a quick one, go for it, John. Oh, a good one.
So the approach of taking third-party voices and giving them and empowering and amplifying them, the risk in that appears to be that if they're critical of our policies or other issues that we do not support, that may put them in contradiction to what we're trying to accomplish on other areas. Case in point, for example, someone may criticize U.S. policy vis-a-vis Israel in the Middle East, but still be strongly anti-terror in their approach. Second, on that, if we are giving them support to amplify their efforts, are we then eliminating their credibility or minimizing or diminishing their credibility? And as you've gone through this process of adopting this approach, have you seen that? How do you foresee us working through those type conflicts?
So it's a very good question, and it comes up all the time. Now, we have allies, even allies in NATO, that we don't agree with about everything, but we support each other. And I think on this spectrum that you see in government of like, we can't help this imam because he criticizes us, and my feeling is to be much more permissive about that. One of the things we talk about when we go around the world is to say, you have to permit dissent in your country. We have to be tolerant of dissent and criticism about us. And so many of these voices would not have credibility against ISIL if they also weren't criticizing us for things. And I think we have to be tolerant of that. And to me, there's a bigger battle. And that bigger battle is against violent extremism and terrorism. And I think it has to be a big tent. And everybody in the tent is not going to always agree with us. And I'm fine with that. There are some people in government who are less tolerant about that. But I really think that we have to link arms with people that once upon a time perhaps we might not want to have done business with.
Jim. Jim, you'll need the mic if you don't mind, because your lav isn't working.
Can I ask, when inevitably your successor gives you a holler, has coffee with you, and asks you to say, cut to the chase about lessons learned in this area, or do's and don'ts, what might your Cliff's notes for him or her be?
I think, again, it's this big insight that it's not a government voice. It's not our government's voice. Our government needs to have a voice on many different things, but when it comes to counter-terrorism and the rise of disinformation and propaganda, I don't think that a government is going to solve those problems. I think those problems will be solved by right-thinking, reasonable people around the world who reject both the terrorism ideas and reject a flow of disinformation. So I think we have to look in the broadest possible way to empower other people. And I think those educational programs that we talked about, in some ways, are a great vehicle for that. I mean, they don't have an immediate positive outcome, but they have a very long-term positive outcome. I mean, if you look at the number of world leaders, for example, who have been Fulbright scholars, I mean, it's kind of extraordinary. And I think that putting more money in both helping credible third-party voices and empowering even more exchanges is a great kind of double whammy.
If we're wrapping up, let me just say personally, let me be overtly, unabashedly political in a way Rick can't, and say how great it's been, and I thank you guys for being involved in a serious discussion on important matters that only parenthetically, because of me, mentioned Donald Trump. So there is hope for us. There is hope. We can go half an hour or so without talking about him. So I thank you so much, and obviously thank my friend Rick, and wish you luck on whatever comes next, even if you don't want to disclose it in this internal State Department feed here today. Thanks so much.
Jim, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our speakers.
Thank you very much.